Welcome, everyone. My name is Devadas Krishnadas. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Future Moves Group, and this is our New Year's Eve broadcast, looking back at a tumultuous 2020 and looking forward to what may lie in store for us in 2021. Now, the obvious thing to talk about is COVID-19. It's transformed all our lives globally in 2020, and I think it's going to continue to be a transformative force in the years to come. Now, the story of 2020 is a complex one because it's not only a public health issue, it's also a social issue, a political issue, an economic issue, and a financial issue. To some extent, it's also a security issue. Some countries have done better than others in coping with COVID. And we're going to look at some of the reasons why there's this variation in performance. One of the reasons is often assumed to be a difference in geography and culture, Asia versus the West. But I don't believe this is the case, simply because countries such as Taiwan, New Zealand, and Singapore and Hong Kong have done better than countries in Western Europe or the United Kingdom or the United States doesn't necessarily translate to the fact that being Asian means that you're better at coping with crisis. However, there are some characteristics which are worth pointing out, which do explain the differentiation in performance. And these carry with it lessons. And these lessons are worth noting because COVID will not necessarily be the last pandemic. It certainly is not the first pandemic that the world has faced. And within this century, we can expect that there will be at least one other pandemic. We cannot tell the frequency analysis. We cannot anticipate when it will come. We cannot anticipate its nature or its characteristics. It could be be much more infectious and fatal than COVID was. One of the issues lies in the quality of governance. And I've written a book called Confronting COVID-19, a strategic playbook for leaders and decision makers. And you can download it from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kinokuniya, goguru.com, or you can find it in the physical bookstores all around Singapore in the United States in Barnes & Noble. It takes a forensic look from a multidimensional lens at the COVID challenge. And it's one of the first books of its kind. So I hope that you avail yourself of the opportunity to learn from it when you get a chance to get a copy. Before I proceed further, I'd like to thank all the staff at Future Moves Group and our clients and our partners for helping me and the firm cope with what has been a very challenging year for our business. Thankfully, we've come through it well, and we're going forward into 2021 even stronger than we went into 2020, which is an achievement in itself. I think this is one of the first lessons of the COVID situation, that no leader can succeed on his or own self. You really have to fall back on your firm culture, your firm institution, and the fundamentals of your business, and the relationships you have within the company and between the company and its partners and with its clients. And this is where, during a crisis, the strength of those relationships really get tested. Now, the first contention of the book is really quality of governance is a differentiating factor in how countries have coped with COVID. And here, governance means more than government. It means participation of businesses and of communities. And countries where there's a very high trust compact between businesses, the community, and the government have done much better than countries which have a very low trust compact. And this is partly because there's a low compliance with government policy and government action, and there's much more hesitancy on the government side to introduce policy action because of its lack of credibility with the enterprises and with the community. A second observable phenomenon is that countries which have leaders which are empathetic to their people, which are open and accountable to their people, did much better than countries which were opaque or which ignored the crisis or ignored their people or did not hold themselves accountable to their people. And this has nothing to do with whether a country was democratic or autocratic. The United States, for instance, is a democracy, but President Donald Trump ignored the crisis, called it a hoax, called it a China virus, did not put together a coherent response at a national level, And as a consequence, the United States, a global superpower, the global superpower, has the highest infection rate, highest total fatality rate, and one of the highest fatality rates. So leadership matters. A third issue is political will, the ability to put in place strong, proactive policies and to ensure that there's surveillance and compliance with these policies is a major differentiating factor between countries that did well and countries that didn't do well. There's also an issue of consistency and constancy in the application of these precautions. What you tend to find is when you have leadership with poor political will or weak political will, they tend to lift the precautions at the earliest possible opportunity before they have taken full effect. And as a consequence, they open themselves up to the vulnerability of second and third waves of infections, as we've seen in many places in Western Europe and within the United States. Multilateralism also mattered significantly. Working together across communities, across countries, between countries, has been vital to trying to accelerate the development of the vaccine or vaccines. And the Friends of COVAX initiative, which was led by the WHO, has been instrumental in ensuring that vaccines have come to an early fruition rather than delayed deployment. We can expect vaccines to be deployed within 2021 in many countries. However, I think it's important to temper expectations about this because of the difficulties in the logistics in vaccine deployment, the cost of vaccine deployment, and because this is a global pandemic, vaccines have to be deployed not only in advanced economies, which have the capacity and capabilities for managing such a deployment, but also in less developed economies, which don't have these capacities and capabilities, and neither do they have the funding. And so we are a very long way from getting over the COVID crisis. And this is a very important inflection point to recognize, which the markets, which are trading on news that vaccines are available, are intentionally ignoring. And so you see markets frothing at highest levels or higher levels than they've ever been, when in fact the reality is that we'll be living with COVID for at least another 2 to 3 years. Another major issue is politicization of the COVID crisis. Countries which dealt with the COVID crisis in an apolitical way did better than countries which made COVID a political pivot point or political divide between their political milieu. And this was most obvious, obviously, in the United States, where Donald Trump used COVID as an example of a democratic hoax, trying to win votes, splitting the country with conspiracy theories, whereas countries such as New Zealand, Singapore, and Hong Kong treated the matter as a public policy issue, public interest issue, and put aside politics and dealt with the problem head on. This brings me to my final point, really, which is that countries which had leaderships which took a scientific evidence-based approach did much better than countries which didn't, which simply ignored the problem, such as Brazil and the United States, or treated it as a hoax. Evidence-based policy action is essential in order to be able to deal with a crisis of this nature. And it's essential that this evidence-based approach be not only at the national level, but at the regional and the global level. And so it underscores the importance of multilateralism and multilateral organizations such as the WHO, which champion such an approach. And it's essential that they continue to receive the support of member nations going forward, which is direct contrast to the United States, which withdrew from the WHO and withheld $400 million of annual funding from the WHO, represented the largest source of funding for the WHO at the height of the COVID crisis, which is an action tantamount to a threat to, existential threat to the global community. Happily, the Friends of COVAX initiative filled the gap. And this is an innovation, public versus private, international organizations, nations coming together in a way to work around the United States, which historically has been a leader in meeting global challenges, but has become an obstructionist, a nationalist, a nation-first country. And so the world has found a way to work around the United States' abdication of its global leadership role. Education is also another issue which we can posit played a role in differentiation. And I say posit because the evidence is still out there. It's largely a form of conjecture. Countries which had a high median level of education had populations which could understand the complexities of the challenge and understand the reasoning behind the precautions necessary, and were more ready and willing to accept the evidence-based approach. Whereas countries or regions within countries, such as Republican states in the United States, which were largely in the middle of the country, which were rural, which in comparative to the coastal states have a lower median level of education, were more willing to believe in conspiracy theories or dismiss the COVID issue as a hoax. And they pay a very high price for that in terms of number of infections and number of deaths. And they continue to pay a high price. So despite the very visible and visceral evidence in front of them, happening to them, they continue to be resistant to precautionary measures and continue to invest faith in conspiracy theories. So the explanation for the variance in performance is as complex as the virus itself, but really the answers are not a secret. And what remains is the question of whether the lessons will be applied, learned and applied in time for the next crisis. And there will be a next crisis. So that's 2020, where global travel came to a complete halt. Global trade already battered by the Trump-inspired China trade tensions took a hammer blow. Aggregate final demand collapsed. The global economy went into a recession. National economies went into deeper recessions. It's a non-trivial event which will define the 2020s. We don't think that just because a vaccine is now available or vaccines are available, that the crisis is over. Far from it. It will take many, many months before the vaccines are deployed in reasonable enough quantities that we can say that the global community is reaching a degree of herd immunity. It may take more than many more months. It may take more than a year or year and a half to be able to reach that point. That's number one. Number two, the virus is mutating. The B.1.1.7 strain, which was first detected in the United Kingdom, is more infectious than the original coronavirus form. And it could mutate again. Mutations make vaccines that we've developed less effective than they otherwise would be. And so this is an ongoing struggle. So far from triumphing and conquering COVID, we have to learn to live with COVID. And so it will be 3 to 5 years before we return to the kind of levels of travel, especially business travel, that we've become accustomed to, that precautions will be lifted completely. I think social distancing, working from home, remote working will continue to be important decelerants of the spread of COVID. And mask wearing and managing large crowds will also continue to be measures that will be in place for a considerable amount of time. Even in countries where vaccinations are compulsory or made voluntary but highly encouraged, and where populations are heavily vaccinated. This is because they'll still be, in an interdependent, interconnected world, vulnerable to inflows from other countries of those who may be coming from places where the vaccine hasn't been fully deployed, or they have not been vaccinated, or they've chosen not to be vaccinated. And so none of us is insulated. None of us are going to be fully protected from the consequences of the ripple effects of the COVID crisis going forward over the next couple of years. Now that all sounds very negative, but there are also some positives. The COVID crisis has accelerated digitalization and adoption of technology, and also been a catalyst for innovation in technology. And that's a good thing, and it will continue to be so. It's also brought together a global community in a way that otherwise would not have happened, and in a way that works around a United States that previously had been considered an indispensable nation. Although the election of President Joe Biden is encouraging and suggests that the United States will rejoin the international community and try to regain and restate its place as a global leader, I think the past 4 years of the Donald Trump administration has made the world very skeptical and cynical about the United States leadership. And as a consequence, it will take considerable amount of time and effort and political capital on the part of President Joe Biden when he takes office in order to be able to restore the credibility of the United States. And that's going to be one of the challenges in 2021. The second challenge is really dealing with markets which have highly overrated the status of the COVID challenge. Markets are at their highest levels historically, and there's a lot of fraud in the markets, largely due to loose fiscal and monetary policies to help countries cope in counter-cyclical ways with the economic impacts of COVID. These monetary supplies have not gone into productive infrastructure, but have gone into speculative ventures, especially in property and equity markets and capital markets. And so it's important to appreciate that these are not actually forward-looking indicators at all, but actually maybe misdirectional indicators. And we could expect a double-dip recession in 2021 when the United States in particular enters into another year of recession instead of making a recovery, largely because of the legacy effects of neglecting the COVID challenge in 2020. Just because there's a change of president doesn't mean that automatically all these problems disappear. And so the world is in for a long, slow recovery that isn't V-shaped at all, but more like a sine wave of a very low trajectory of potential growth. And there will be countries that do better than others. These are largely countries which have done well at a national level managing COVID. However, in the interconnected world, most of these countries, especially those in Asia, demand from the West, demand from large economies drives their economic performance. And so unless these Western economies and the United States in particular get their house in order and get back to a growth trajectory, there's actually a limited headroom for Asian economies to grow. And I think that's very important to understand, and it's a second very major inflection point to register. Another phenomena that we need to appreciate is that faith and confidence in multilateral institutions has been significantly undercut and eroded by the United States under Donald Trump. We see this in the TPP negotiation, we see this in the Paris Climate Agreement, we see this in the way that the trade tensions with China have been instigated and then deepened by aggressive policies put in by his administration. These kinds of trends are difficult to reverse, even with the best of intentions. And so it will take time for multilateralism to reconcrete itself and for countries to find a way to work together once again in a more harmonious way that supports global free trade and supports the free flow of people and ideas and capital to the benefit of all. A third inflection point is that COVID shows that global existential events are possible despite our advanced technologies, despite the fact that we have advanced medical science. One of the biggest challenges that are still out there is climate change. And so it remains to be seen whether countries, as a result of the COVID crisis, can come out of the crisis working together to try to deal with climate change in a serious way. While the Paris Climate Agreement was admirable, unfortunately it was full of pledges and promises and not binding agreements. And pledges and promises are easy to make on a grandeur scale, whereas commitments are difficult to make even on a marginal scale. So until the world gets serious about climate change, I think we're going to see more natural disruptions and occurring more frequently and on a more intense scale across the world. And that's going to have economic consequences, that's going to have social consequences, and that's going to have political consequences. And we're running out of time. So it's important that we come away from the COVID crisis looking beyond the crisis into other global scale challenges that are more long fuse rather than short fuse and fast moving like a pandemic, but require us to take action early and sustain that action and take that action at a systemic, structured, sustained level in order to be able to be equal to the task of the challenge itself. And climate change is certainly a profound challenge for the world at large. I think the last inflection point I'd like to point out is that living with COVID is not a fatal situation. The workarounds that the world will be able to come up with will stand it in good stead and test the resiliency of nations. One of the characteristics of a crisis is it really puts companies, it puts countries, it puts societies to what has been called by some economists as the Rorschach's test. It reveals to you your real substance as opposed to your posturing. And I think some countries which had posturing that they were strong and they were coherent and cohesive proved not to be. They became very divisive, became very fragile, became very vulnerable. The United States is again a perfect archetype example. Whereas I think countries such as New Zealand and countries such as Singapore have become much more socially inclusive and socially cohesive as a result of going through the crisis together. What this means is that more than institutions and more than simply having financial capacities, social qualities and psychological qualities matter significantly in dealing with crisis. And that's true at the individual level, as well as at the organizational level and at the societal level. And those things are not self-enacting, they are not self-manifesting. They do require a context of culture, but they also require a context of nurturing in order to ensure that the countries, individuals, and organizations are more resilient to crisis. Resiliency is where you can bounce back from crisis, you can adapt and survive. It's not about robustness, whether you survive or fail. It's about how you'll be able to cope with crisis, make rapid changes in order to be able to overcome it, work around it. And that's going to be critical to doing well collectively in the face of future crises, regardless of the nature of that kind of crisis, whether it's financial, economic, or a natural climate disaster. So the human factor qualities are very much more important, in my view, than simply the technological innovations that have occurred as a result of COVID or were occurring already before COVID but have been accelerated. Human factor qualities require still leadership. They require investment in education. They require investment in public health. They require a sense of community. It requires the participation of a whole of nation approach to strengthening economies, strengthening nations, strengthening societies. And I think that's going to be an important point of divergence to the 2020s, countries which can manage to do that and countries which do the opposite, which become more divided, more divisive, more contrasted, and more contested. And those that travel both trajectories are going to end up with very different futures. So that's our view of the world that's going to come and the world that has already passed. And we hope that you've learned from this, and we look forward to you having a better year in 2021 than you may have done in 2020. It's important to stay optimistic. It's important to take the right lessons away and see the opportunities, not just the risks, to see the upsides, not just the downsides. The world will survive COVID. It has survived many, many things before. What matters is picking up the right lessons and applying them with will and commitment. And that's true at the individual level, it's true at the business level, and it's true at the national level, and it's also true at the international level. And with that, I'd like to wish you a Happy New Year and all the best from the Future Moves Group to you and yours. We look forward to engaging with you again in 2021. Thank you.